In 1894, the Canadian Pacific built a railway line spanning between Rosebery and Nakusp, BC during the mining boom of the 1890s. The line was unable to run straight to Castlegar or Nelson due to the Cape Horn bluffs between Slocan City and Silverton, BC. On account of this complication, Canadian Pacific had to operate a rail barge between Rosebery and Slocan, BC, along the Slocan Lake. The barge journey took 3 to 4 hours and afforded the train crew time to relax and talk while the tugboat pulled the twin-track vessel at a leisurely pace across the Slocan Lake. Though rail fans and train enthusiasts thoroughly enjoyed this route, their fondness for the line was futile in prolonging its survival. Nakusp, which was the railhead, was now large enough to effectively sustain itself without the railway. Due to the competition of trucking and air traffic freight against the railway, CP decided to abandon the Rosebery line in 1988. The last train ran on March 2, 1989, and since then, much of the Rosebery route has become the Slocan Valley Rail Trail, which can still be hiked along to this day. Now, let's take a journey through time as we explore the Canadian Pacific's Rosebery route. The town of Rosebery was small yet inviting, dwarfed further by the mountains that surrounded it. Like all towns, it had a general store for the basic needs of the townfolk, across the street from which was Mountain Models, the local town's hobby shop. On the west side of town was a collection of buildings designed to serve the railway. The first of which is the Rosebery Station, built in the 1890s. The building was likely expanded on in the early 1900s or 19-teens, with the addition of what appears to be a station master's office and a passenger waiting area expansion in the back of the building. The station in Rosebery is of a more unique design than most CP stations, which had the station master's office as an upper floor. These photos show the station in 1973, showing signs of visible disrepair. Between the station and the bridge is another building, likely the CPR section house, more commonly known as the bunkhouse. This structure may also have been the switchman's office or yard office. The area was also littered with storage sheds serving different purposes. This one would have housed at least 2 speeder cars for track inspection, as the short pieces of track in front of the shed reveal. These would allow the crew to pull the speeder to the mainline track, then lift and turn it onto the railway mainline. The process is reversed when putting the speeder back into the shed. The speeder shed stood at the north end of the yard, at the very edge of the curve immediately before the first switch. Another shed stood somewhere else in or near the yard, though its exact location is unknown. This building may have held coal or wood for town heating, or may have just been a general goods storage facility. Notice the 40-foot flat car parked out front of the building, a sight long gone from railways. This photo, taken from the railway bridge, shows the basic layout of the train yard. The turnout in the foreground led to the turning Y used to turn equipment, most frequently locomotives. The middle turnout that veers off to the right was part of a small passing siding between the station and the section house. And finally, the far turnout led to the rail barge slip. It had another 2 switches on the same track that expanded the yard for switching purposes. Shown here are the 4 tracks in front of the station. Today, the railway buildings and track are gone. Only a faint outline within the weeds and paths splitting the trees remain as the sole reminder that once a railway ran through Rosebery. Along the curve leading up to the slip, the track split in two. The barge slip could be raised and lowered depending on the water level. This is the rail section when the slip was raised, but not fully. When loading or unloading equipment, the slip was raised to meet the rail and deck height of the barge, creating a rather short yet steep grade, posing more of a challenge for the otherwise basic switching movements. In the 70s and 80s, near the end of the line's service, the main commodity shipped was lumber coming from Slocan and wooden poles coming out of a plant in Nakusp, though general goods boxcars and occasional hoppers would frequent the line also. This photo from 1975 shows 4 general goods boxcars, 3 of which in boxcar red-brown with script lettering, and 3 empty flat cars being unloaded by a GP9 8700, a unit in the Action Red multimark scheme that debuted in 1968. On August 1, 1970, the inbound barge from Slocan docked in Rosebery. The equipment to be unloaded was a string of general goods boxcars, most of which in multimark, and a plywood rebuilt caboose in the same scheme. The unit doing the unloading was GP9 8637, built in 1957. Here, the unit is seen in the short-lived high multimark with 8-inch stripes, the unit's second repaint. Some of the photos are from colored slides, and others from black and white photographs. As each section was unloaded, the cars would be placed in the yard while the locomotive ran back to the barge to get the rest. Once the cars were in the yard, the train would be assembled with the caboose at the back and locomotive at the front. The Y could be used here to turn the locomotive for the trip to Nakusp if necessary. The operation would have taken about an hour and a half to 2 hours to unload the cars and correct their order. On a different day, in 1982, 8637 is seen in Rosebery once again, only this time loading the barge with an outbound train. The first barge load consisted of 2 flat cars loaded with wood poles, 2 general goods boxcars, and a CP wide vision caboose. The second load would have consisted of all boxcars, seen here while the barge departed for Slocan with the first set of cars. It wasn't uncommon for the barge to make 2 or 3 trips for one train to complete its journey across the Slocan Lake. The Rosebery line served a good 95 years before its closure in 1989. The route saw a plethora of power, from the Baldwin-built consolidations of the late 1800s, to the D10s of the 1900s, to the GP9s and baby train masters of the 50s. Because of the tight curves and light rails, GP9s were the most common power on this route in the diesel era, rivaled only by the CLC-built baby train masters. The towns along this route no longer have the railway. The tracks have been removed, structures demolished, and as time progresses, memories forgotten. Though the line hasn't seen a train in over 30 years, many rail fans recall the pleasant sound of the trains rolling over jointed rails. The sights, sounds, and smells of coal soot, diesel fumes, and fresh lumber moving through town. Many will recall the sights and sounds of tugboats docking, the barge preparing for unloading, or the sound of the coupler slack as locomotives revved up to move cars up and down the short slope to load or unload the rail barge. Indeed, the line is abandoned, but the memories are not lost. The Nakusp to Rosebery and beyond route will forever be part of the history of the rails of Canada.